All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the ISF Chinese Research Center Dunhuang Lecture Series. My name is Bill Mack. I'm the director of the Chinese Research Center here at ISF Academy. So welcome. And today we are very honored to have Professor Lisa Raffles of the University of California, Riverside, to be here with us to give a talk on the topic of the invention of the body in Greece and China. Just a brief introduction of Professor Raffles. Professor Lisa Raffles studies the culture of early China and classical Greece with interest in comparative philosophy, history of science, and occasionally science fiction studies. She is distinguished professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and Languages at the University of California, Riverside, with cooperating appointments in the Departments of Philosophy and Religion. She is the author of a number of works, including Knowing Words, Wisdom and Cunning in the Classical Traditions of China and Greece, 1992, Sharing the Light, Representations of Women and Virtue in Early China, 1998, Divination and Prediction in Early China and Ancient Greece, published by Cambridge in 2013, and most recently, this year, right here, Tripartite Self, Body, Mind, and Spirit in Early China, published by OUP, Oxford University Press, in 2023. So let us have a round of applause to welcome Professor Raffles.
First of all, just to check, this is audible, as it should be, yeah? Okay, great. First of all, I want to thank the ISF Academy and to thank Dr. Bill Mack for this wonderful invitation. I haven't been to Hong Kong since before COVID, and it's really a pleasure to be back here again. The remarks I'm going to give to you today are actually closely related to a tripartite self. That is, this book was intended to be a comparative project, looking at, between China and Greece, at Chinese and Greek ideas of how the body, the mind, and the spirit or soul in a Greek context relate to each other. But there turned out to be a lot of problems on the Chinese side that would have drowned in a comparison. So I sort of took a breather from that project, was the result. So now I'm back to the original project, the original paper, as it were. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is part of that project. So it's a work in progress. Now, first of all, I'm thinking that everyone here has a body. The people online, I can't see yours, but I'm guessing you have them. We all have one, but what does it mean to have a body, right? We all know we have one, right? But even the word have is problematic when we think of it. If we start talking about what the Greeks called the soul, the psyche, we have some notion that we have a soul or a self or something. Is it inside? What is it? But it's very tricky. We think we have one, but it's hard to articulate what it is. Nonetheless, the relation between the two, between the body in Greek soma and the soul in Greek psyche, the origin, of course, of our term psychology, is one of the long-standing issues in the history of Greek and later Western reflective thought. Starting from the Homeric poems, it leaves its traces in many, many questions. So I think it's a fundamental topic, and it's a problem that, by the way, is not going to be solved this afternoon. But there's a problem that this very long and sustained Greek history of psyche and soma actually tends to focus on psyche. It focuses on the problem of the soul, and not so much on the body, which the soul has some relation to. So what I want to look at today is the very different ways that the body was first understood as an explicit concept. That is, we all have one, right? But an explicit concept of the body is different than having one. And this is important. So what I want to look at is the different ways in which the explicit concept of a body was first understood in a range of Greek, Chinese texts and also genres. So on the Greek side, the texts go from the Homeric poems. And by the way, I use the term Homeric poems because I don't believe there was a blind guy named Homer who wrote them. There's a long digression there that I'll spare us all. So from the Homeric poems through Plato, and on the Chinese side, the 4th through 2nd centuries BCE. What I'm going to argue is that I'm going to use the term body in scare quotes, by which I mean Greek soma and several Chinese terms, xing, ti, and shan, which I'll come to in a moment, that the body emerged as an explicit concept in 5th century Greece and 4th century China. However, Chinese and Greek accounts of the body emphasized very, very different things and had different conceptual foci, beginning with interest in very different kinds of natures, that is, the nature of the body. Now, it's all too easy to take the body as a physical object for granted, forgetting that it has a genealogy and a conceptual history. We're so used to having one that it's easy to forget that there's a long history of how we thought about it. But the nature of the body isn't given or obvious. For example, for the philosopher Bernard Williams, we all have a body, but we don't actually all agree on having a soul, which is more speculative or theoretical. So for example, an important aspect of any concept of the body or conceptualization of the body is its physical boundaries. Think for just a moment about the boundaries of yours. What is the distinction between the interior regions of the body and the exterior? What is the interior? What is physical? What are these entities that are ontologically distinct, for example, in substance dualism? Now, the evidence of anthropology makes clear that categories about the body are not universal, that they're culturally specific. For example, the Amazonian anthropologist, that is the anthropologist of the Amazon, Philippe Descola, has argued that there is some perceived distinction between what he calls physicality and interiority as a human universal. That is, there's a distinction, but that the management of the distinction is culturally specific. Descola's analysis vividly shows us that even if a concept of physicality is universal, it does not map onto our bodies in any straightforward way. The historian of Greek medicine, Brooke Holmes, has argued that we need to separate the conceptual history of soma, that is the body, from that of psyche, the soul. Because the body must be understood as what she calls a conceptual object, or to use her term, an epistemic thing. How's that for a strange word to take away? And furthermore, that the conceptualization of the body in Greece also helped motivate the conceptualization of the soul. That it was only after the Greeks conceptualized the body that they were able to conceptualize the soul. And in particular, conceptualize the soul as the locus of a person. That is, we all think we're a person, but where does it live? Now, a Chinese history of the body presents different problems, both conceptual and contextual. Now, philosophical debates about mind-body dualism have become very important in Chinese and comparative philosophy. Why? Because of claims that Chinese thought is holist, including claims that there was no mind-body dualism in early China, versus Western thought that is dualist, and contrast between supposed Chinese holism and Western dualism. But as we will see, early Chinese accounts of the body occur in what I'd like to call the context of self-cultivation literature that don't easily map onto these easy distinctions. So here's a couple of visual versions of the question of which body. The picture at the top, a vase painting, shows this is a picture of the soul. Now, I'm guessing that none of you think that you have anything like this running around in the inside of your head, right? But here we have, let's see, is this working? Yes. Is that working? Yes. So here is the charioteer. This is tologistikon, that is the rational faculty. And he's driving two horses. That is a human driving two horses. One of them is thumoedes, that is the horse who's spirited. And the other is, the black horse is epithumetikon, the horse of appetite. So it's pretty clear who's in charge here, right? By contrast, the lower picture is a meditation text from the Neijing Tu. This is a Taoist meditation text. And this is showing an inner landscape of the body. That we have, the writing is too small to see, but it gives various fields and parts of the body that you access through meditation techniques, including, in some cases, stars and places where star spirits literally come down and enter your body and educate you. And so this is a text for self-cultivation. So although we all seem to have a body that, although we have differences of coloring and whatnot, we all have 2 arms and 2 legs, or most of us, and 1 head, and various things. But these 2 pictures of, this isn't even the body, this is the soul, are quite different, aren't they? Now, in The Discovery of the Mind, the classicist Bruno Snell famously argued that Homer had no concept of the body because in the Homeric poems, the term soma, the term for body, always referred to a corpse and never to a living person. On Snell's view, the Homeric authors had no awareness of the body and soul as a natural division of a person. And Snell correspondingly reduces the Homeric heroes to fragmented, unreflective amalgams. And one of the many objections to this view, which I think is nowadays largely discredited, is that the problem is that Snell is interested in the psyche, not in the body at all. However, when we turn to the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, they resist any discussion of items like body, mind, or soul, because these categories simply don't exist in those poems. These are not universal categories. And making distinctions between what is the body and what is the soul is equally problematic. Let me give one example from a family of words connected with thumos. The same word is epithumetikon. That the term propides can refer to a physical location in the body, but that is, there's one reference to a spear striking a man in the liver beneath the propides, right? That's a location. But it can also refer to ingenuity or cunning skill. For example, in the artifacts of Hephaestus. The propides can be the seat of an emotion. For example, sorrow departing from the propides of Hecuba, the wife of Priam, or Achilles' desire for weeping when he sees the body of his, and when he mourns with Priam over the body of Achilles, or the departure of Achilles' propides and limbs. There is no one word that denotes the living body as a whole in the Homeric poems. And there's a complex vocabulary that addressed various aspects of bodies. So, for example, Homeric persons had a visible form, which in Greek was demos or eidos. Homeric bodies had skin and flesh, in Greek kros, rhinos, sarx. And Homeric bodies had limbs, guea, malea. But on the other hand, the term rhinos, our English word rhinoceros is from the same root, or the term derma, as in dermatology, tended to denote the boundaries of animal bodies, not human bodies. However, when the Homeric poems talk about dead bodies in Hades, they use different terms. The physical remains of a dead person were nekus, or nekros, that is, the corpse, but they were also the eidolon, the shadow or shade. The souls of dead people, the psyche, were also importantly material. The psyche was not an immaterial thing. It had material existence. Dead Homeric psyches could drink, pardon me a second, and indeed the psyches had to drink sacrificial blood in order to regain consciousness. They manifested wearing armor and clothing. An example of this is the famous scene in Book 11 of the Odyssey where Odysseus goes to Hades and performs a blood sacrifice to revivify the psyche of the seer Tiresias to ask him how to get home to Ithaca. Tiresias couldn't take form and answer him until he had drunk the blood. So this is an example of a psyche drinking. As the classicist Douglas Cairns trenchantly puts it, the reason for inconsistency in accounts of the post-mortem soul is that, quote, the only model of personhood that we possess is based on our experience of living, breathing, thinking, feeling, embodied human beings, which we all are. An analog from a very separate context, if I may, of science fiction, is our complete inability to imagine a truly alien language or describe one in detail, because we are essentially hardwired to our embodied experience of being human beings for all the diversity that that experience represents in the variety of human beings. Now, another approach that's especially interesting for a history of the body is not whether it's alive or dead, but whether it's formed or disintegrated. Let's look at this. Now, the term soma occurs very rarely in Homer, but the term soma is used of a body on the verge of losing its defining form. For example, a living being at the verge of death. At Iliad chapter 3, lines 21 to 28, a lion comes upon a stag or a goat, possibly still alive, and devours it. Sorry to bring up an unpleasant scene. In Book 12 of the Odyssey, Circe describes a shipwreck and a sea thick with bodies, that is, human bodies, but still, possibly still alive, but presumably not for long, since they're in the process of drowning after a shipwreck. So both the stag and the sailors in the sea are living bodies that are on the edge of becoming something else. Now, these instances occur in contexts that are defined by animality and indifference to humanity. What does that mean? Both portray a kind of flesh that's about to become formless, passing into a kind of an animal economy, not a human economy, which is described in an account of a dead foe slain in battle that is left as food for dogs and fish or birds. As Vernon puts it, to hand someone over to wild animals doesn't just mean to deprive them of the status of a dead man by preventing a funeral. It's also to dissolve the person into confusion and return them to chaos, into utter non-humanity. So not having a proper funeral is bad, but that's not the worst of it. In the belly of the beasts that have devoured him, he becomes the flesh and blood of wild animals, and is no longer, and there is no longer the slightest appearance or trace of humanity. He is no longer in any way a person. Now, this is a rather unpleasant example, and I'm sorry to bring a disturbing one, but this passage makes clear that soma isn't just a corpse, nor is it just a complement of psyche. It's a kind of incorporated, formed human being. Now, let me move on. Explicit Greek concepts of the physical body began with the speculations of 6th and 5th century pre-Socratic philosophers about the ultimate constituents and causes of perceived phenomena. They developed new explanations based on impersonal forces rather than divine powers, and they conceptualized these objects and forces as having natures. The Greek term is physis. So the result was what philosophers call the inquiry into nature. And the first of these philosophers to give an account of nature is Heraclitus, who says, I will distinguish each thing according to its nature. And here it is, kataphusin in Greek. Does anyone here study Greek? So I will distinguish each thing according to its nature and explain how it is. The 5th century philosophers and the medical theorists who followed their example gave universal explanations for change in the natural world, where substances are moved by impersonal forces and causes rather than being moved by the will of the gods. So this is, if you like, a mechanical or rational world, not a world in which the gods at their pleasure decide what happens to us. And that these changes happen according to explicit principles of regularity that apply both to living and non-living things. Now, one of the claims associated was the claim that the body has a nature. And this is the focus of a particular text by one of the Hippocratic authors. I imagine that many of you have heard of Hippocrates, but in fact these are multi-authored texts over a wide period of time, and one of them is titled On the Nature of a Human Being. Now, an important part of that nature was that the behavior of human beings as material objects in the physical world. Like other material objects, human bodies were understood as physical compounds that behave in regular ways. For example, according to one text titled On Regimen, all living things are composed of fire and water in a dynamic mixture. According to the text titled On Ancient Medicine, different powers in foods, sweet, bitter, etc., are both inside and outside a human being. That is, these are, if you like, universal compounds that exist outside of us but also constitute us. Now, many discussions of there are many discussions of soma, or the body, in the Hippocratic corpus, and many of them occur in a context that involves the diagnosis of disease and the therapy of disease. So these are not occurring in a philosophical context, but in the specific medical context of a patient comes to see you who is ill. You have to figure out what's wrong with him or her, and you need to prescribe a therapy. Medical writers so wanted to explain disease in terms of the material physical body, rather than on an older model of invasive divine activity. So, for example, in the beginning of the Iliad, for various reasons, the god Apollo literally shoots arrows and sends down a plague, which decimates the Greek army. This is a theory of disease. It's not just a battle scene in an ancient epic. That in that theory, disease is caused by the hostile activity of a god or spirit. By contrast, according to the Hippocratic authors, diseases occur for natural causes. And so the concept of a physical or a biological body first appears in Western medical and philosophical traditions in the Hippocratic corpus, not in philosophical texts. So the Hippocratic authors used the body as an organizing principle to understand health and disease, but also to understand human nature. So the result was a new way of understanding the body as an object of medical knowledge, but also as a philosophical problem. One of these texts, titled On Regimen 1, describes the natures of soma, the body, and psyche as two distinct but related aspects of human nature. So the text says, I maintain that one who intends to write correctly concerning the regimen of human beings must first know and discern the nature of human beings in general. This is to know what they're composed from and discern by what they are controlled. So into humans, in the second quotation, there enters a soul, a psyche, that is a mixture of fire and water, a component of a person's body. So knowledge of the dominating forces of the body, in this case fire and water, is necessary to provide treatment effectively. These examples attest to the importance that physicians placed on understanding the natures of the substances that interacted in the bodies of their patients. But this understanding requires a conceptualization of the body. It's not, if you will, empirical trial and error. It involves having a specific concept of what a body is made of. On Regimen also describes interactions between fire and water in the body. So it says, like carpenters sawing a log, and this is the two-handled saw model where you have one guy on one end and one guy on the other, or not guy. Just as carpenters sawing a log, one pulls and the other pushes, but they're doing the same thing. And in another quotation, when the carpenter saw, one pushes and the other pulls. Both are doing the same thing. They're imitating the nature of human beings. So this pushing and pulling is also compared to the work of other craftsmen, including cobblers, who use division and reassembling to create a harmony out of diverse parts. You take your shoes in to be resoled or whatever, and they take it apart and put it together, and what you get is a nice, good, intact shoe at the end. So these passages make clear that for these Hippocratic authors, both soma and psyche are composed of different mixtures of fire and water. And I'm going to skip a little bit of the detail, but just as a sidebar, the greatest intelligence comes from a blend of the moistest fire and the driest water, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? I don't think time permits going into that in detail, but this seemed to be what they recommended. Now, the interesting part here is that this theory had consequences, that the right regimen, the right set of diet, exercise, etc., can improve the mixture, can improve the balance. That it can make the blend of fire and water better, but also worse in the body and the soul by improving the balance. And again, the relation is repeatedly described as a tension that produces harmony. Now, these medical texts give us accounts of the body and its nature and represent it as an object of technical knowledge and mastery. So the Hippocratic authors use the notion of nature to explain soma and psyche in a range of contexts. But notice that these authors identified the person with the body. But as a result of the conceptualization of the body, the forces that governed its well-being were conceptualized as natural forces. These forces also had natures that operated regularly. Now, this new medical account of the body created ethical problems. Why would that be? Insofar as the forces that governed the body could be manipulated by the expert knowledge of a skilled physician, this expertise offered the prospect of mastery. That is, a skilled physician could tell you how to get the right regime, the right diet, exercise, doing the right kind of exercise at the right time of year, drinking and eating the right things, all these kinds of things. That the idea that you can optimize things implies a kind of a responsibility to do so, doesn't it? If we can control our health by what we eat and all the rest, if we can, then we should. And I'm sure we've all come across versions of this in our contemporary lives, right? And so this includes responsibility, and that responsibility introduces an ethical dimension into notions of the body. The ethical problem goes something like this. If we become responsible for symptoms because we can control things, but also capable of deflecting blame, it follows that the care or maintenance of our physical body becomes an ethical responsibility. We're responsible for regimen. For any embodied person who's considered capable of self-mastery. Now, if we think about popular culture, there's lots of ways in which that view can be really destructive, right? Because it can create a lot of pressure and stress for people, but for whatever reasons, that doesn't work for. And there's no solution here, but my point for the moment is that what had become a descriptive problem has now become an ethical problem, because of this notion of implied responsibility to manage the components of our conceptualized body. And this is the argument of the Hippocratic text titled A Regimen for Health. And the ending says this: it is necessary that a man, and by the way, the Greek word is man here, not person, that a man who is wise should consider that health is the greatest of human blessings and learn how, by his own thought, to derive benefit in his illnesses. Now, this passage identifies the individual as male, that is, it's andra, not anthropos. So it does not claim the mastery of health as a universal human capacity. That is, the author could have written this sentence with a gender-neutral term, but he didn't. But nonetheless, the gesture toward the ability to be responsible for the care and mastery of our physical bodies become important parts of the identity of people as social agents. Okay, now what I'd like to do is to turn to Platonic accounts of the body. And here there is a problem. Now, accounts of the body of Soma, we find them throughout the dialogues of Plato. But the problem is, again, that Plato's view of Soma tends to be distracted by his view of Psyche, of the soul, which is really his main interest. So although he seems to be talking about the body, his real object of interest is in the soul, in contrasting them. His overarching move is to take a problem or a concept that was previously applied to the soma, to the body, and then to apply it to the psyche, or the soul. Now we find three different accounts of the body in the dialogues. The first one is rejecting earlier beliefs that the self was the body. That is the idea that you are your body. Plato says this is wrong. In favor of the idea that the self is the psyche. Suddenly you are your soul, whatever that is and wherever it lives. We find this view in the Apology, in the Alcibiades, in the Charmides, and in the Republic. Now, a related but slightly different position is that the soul is the master of the body. And we find this claim in the Phaedo and the Timaeus. Now, that's the first account, right, that the person is the soul, not the body. A second account is an analogy that Plato makes between the physician and the philosopher. That is, that the philosopher is the physician to the soul. And we find these accounts also in a number of dialogues. And finally, Plato introduces a tripartite portrayal of the soul in the Republic in Phaedrus, which was the illustration with which we began. But all of these positions focus on the psyche and attempt to detach the soma from the psyche as much as possible. And what I think I'm going to do in the interests of time is to sort of skip over some of the details of the Platonic account and move to the Chinese discovery of the body, because I'm a little worried that we're going a little behind time. I'm now going to turn to several Chinese accounts of the body, beginning with views attributed to Yang Zhu, who lived from roughly 370 to 350 BCE, and the elaboration of these views in the Guanzi and the Zhuangzi, and some other texts. Now, I'm going to use, we have one nice little term, body, in English, but as I think you all know better than I do, there is no one term for the body in Chinese. So I'm going to convenience three different English terms for three different Chinese terms to not, as it were, squelch them into one. So, and remember also that classical Chinese is a little bit different than Putonghua in the way in which it handles this. So for the word ti, I'm going to use the English term the frame, that is the concrete physical body. For xing, the form of the body, I'm going to use the term form. And for shen, that is the socialized and embodied person, I'm going to use the English term embodied person. And finally, two other very important terms, xin, the mind or the heart-mind, and finally shen, the spirit. And of course, the term shen refers both to the kind of external spirits to whom one offers prayer and sacrifice, but also to a spirit capacity that is internal and typically lives in, literally dwells in, the xin, located in the center of the chest. So this is an attempt, as it were, in English to not do violence to the more elaborate Chinese vocabulary. So that was just a preamble to help disentangle, because most translations simply use the term body for all of this. So now the body became a central issue in Chinese thought, initially with the school of Yang Zhu, and also a chapter of the Guanzi entitled Neya, or inner cultivation. Now, part of the problem with Yang Zhu is there is no Yangzi, there is no text attributed to him. If you think about the Mengzi and the Shunzi, there's a text, but no text has survived of Yang Zhu. So we don't entirely know what he thought. We only know about him from third parties, some of whom didn't approve of him. So we only know about what I'll call Yangist ideas from others' accounts, and again, often by philosophical enemies. But in all of the presentations of Yangist doctrines, concern about the body is really important. And the core of Yangist teachings was the supreme value of life and the body. So, for example, he says preserving one's nature entailed nourishing bodily energies and developing bodily powers. But the problem is we hear most about him from his enemies. So we have, for example, in the Mengzi, this account. Yangzi, Master Yang, held to each for oneself. If plucking a single hair would benefit the entire world, he wouldn't do it. And you've probably read this quotation somewhere. Well, that's pretty nasty, isn't it? A less hostile version occurs in the Huainanzi. Keep one's nature intact, guard one's true self, and not tie down one's body with external objects. In this case, actually, it's one's form. So that's a rather more sympathetic account than the Mengzi, isn't it? Now we can learn a bit more about Yangzhu's ideas from other sources, which identify essential nature, xing, with life, sheng. In other words, keeping your essential nature intact means preserving your true self and what is genuine, but it also means preserving your health, safety from danger, and living out your natural lifespan. Now, all this sounds very nice, but what is so important about these passages? The scholar John Emerson argues that Yangzhu's major innovation in Chinese intellectual history is literally a discovery of the body. He argues that Warring States period thinkers redefined the relationship between the individual and the state, resulting in both a new political order and a new sense of self. And Yangzhu's emphasis on the body, on preserving one's inner nature, offered freedom from ritual roles, clan identifications, and the obligations to the spirits that went with all of this, and that had previously defined people as persons. Before, you were defined as a person by ritual roles, clan identifications, and your relationship to ancestral spirits. Suddenly, if you have a body whose inner nature you can preserve and keep intact and live out your natural lifespan, it's a different sense of who you are. Notice that I have not used the word individualism. Now, so Yang's doctrines introduced the identification of persons with their physical bodies in a reconfiguration of relations between self and other and individual and group and public and private relationships. So the result is a new sense of self that was unified rather than plural, context independent rather than context grounded, autonomous, and clearly located in space and time. So as a result, both ancestral spirits and clan relationships, if you like, get put at more of a distance. So in summary then, awareness of the body as a site of development and power first emerged in China through the obscure and peripheral teachings of Yangzhu. I'm guessing that many of you have probably studied sort of accounts of Chinese thought and Chinese philosophy, but how much time did you spend on Yangzhu? Not much, I'm guessing, right? But according to Emerson, he's actually a very important figure, at least in this context. So with this new view of the body became a topic of discourse that was used by different traditions in different ways to articulate their own values and priorities. Now these ideas are further developed in the Guanzi, in the chapter Inner Workings and Arts of the Mind, that is Neiye and Xinshu, as well as in the Zhuangzi, and also excavated texts from Ma Wangdui and the Huainanzi. And these texts contrast to other texts that emphasize the subordination of the body to the Xin or the heart-mind. These texts privilege the body as a site of self-cultivation, in particular as a site of the development of Shen, spirit. But interestingly, in some cases, they marginalize or even disparage Xin, the heart-mind. They all identify the preservation of inherent nature with the cultivation of spirit, Shen. And they describe a system of practices, which before going into individual texts, let me just describe the overall shape. That is, these self-cultivation procedures work like this, that we have qi that naturally circulates in our body, right? It is refined into jing, into essence. The essence circulates in the body and is made still and unified by self-cultivation practices. When the jing and qi in the body is still and unified, jing is transformed into shan, which is then stored away, zang, literally treasured in the xin, in the heart-mind, and then circulated through it, through the body. So spirit, shan, internally that is thus produced by the activity of the body in creating, regulating, and transforming qi into jing and stabilizing it. So in short, the if you like, the cauldron of self-cultivation is the body. It's not some mental process that one does by sitting and thinking. Do we have time to take a look at a couple of examples? So let's look at, first of all, the guanzi. So the Neya, or inner workings chapter, argues that humans have the potential to gain the kind of powers that we associate with spirits, with external spirits, by correctly cultivating our qi and jing, and creating shan, spirit, in a settled heart-mind. Now, the process is significantly embodied. First of all, spirit is produced from the concentration of jing and qi, and that these are the same components that literally constitute the frame and form, the ti and the xing, of the body. Secondly, the attainment of wisdom, of inner power, the thing that all these texts tell us we should do, right, requires literally creating a lodging place in the body for shan, for spirit to live in. So we literally have to create a house for shan inside our bodies. But the problem is that essence, jing, can only lodge, take hold, and dwell in a heart-mind that is stable or settled, a dingxin. And this process of cultivating the heart-mind is what makes possible the growth of spirit, and also, by the way, the understanding of Tao. So inner workings then describes a variety of methods for doing this, and time doesn't permit going through them in detail. There's some account of these actually in this book, so if you're interested, you can go through it. But these passages are the beginning of a complex description of interactions, between body, mind, and spirit. And so I'm going to leave that. What I'd like to do is to give one or two remarks about the zhuangzi and then turn to comparative perspectives. Now, the zhuangzi, unlike the guanzi, rejects any authority of the completed heart-mind. It describes forgetting and fasting the heart-mind. It says, don't listen with the ear, listen with the heart-mind. Don't listen with the heart-mind, listen with the qi. And several passages refer to spirit dwelling in the body, to the exclusion of the heart-mind. For example, the second quotation, permit your ears and eyes to penetrate internally and push the knowledge of the heart-mind outside. And then ghosts and spirits will come in and inhabit, and how much more so humans. Another passage says, don't belabor your form, that is, don't belabor your xing. Don't agitate your essence, and then you'll live a long time. When the heart-mind has nothing that it knows, your spirit, your shan, will guard your form, and the form will live a long time. So to summarize the Chinese material, these passages allow us to trace a different awareness of the nature of the body. That the body is important as a place for self-care. And we get this from Yang Zhu, the idea of guarding your inner essence. The self-cultivation chapters of the Guanzi essentially tell us how to stabilize the qi and jing in our bodies to create a lodging place for the heart-mind. And finally, the zhuangzi perceives the heart-mind as an obstacle to self-cultivation, that you need to fast the heart-mind, you need to get rid of it. although learning how to do so very much requires the use of the heart-mind. Were there more time, I would also talk about the 10 questions text from Ma Wang-dui, but the time isn't there. So let me move to a couple of comparative conclusions. In both Greece and China, we find the emergence of the body as a concept, but as I think we've already seen, a different kind of concept and for different reasons. Their accounts of the body emphasize different things. First of all, they're interested in different kinds of natures. The Hippocratic physicians were interested in the idea that things had universal natures, or a physis, and the body had one. By contrast, the youngest account of the body construed it as the property of an individual, that it was disaggregated from social roles. It wasn't related to universal concepts. Now, Chinese and Greek histories of the body also operated in very different intellectual contexts. Pre-Socratic and Hippocratic accounts of the body occur in a scientific and medical context, whereas Yang Zhu, his view of the body was political, insofar as it rejected the norms of seeking office. When you seek office and serve a state, you put your body in danger, and he's counseling, in a sense, to not do this. Greek and Chinese claims about the body also had very different relations to medicine. The Greek history of the body is very much an interaction between philosophy and medicine, whereas in a Chinese context, the two seem to have almost nothing to do with each other. They didn't speak to each other. And finally, both Chinese and Greek understandings of the body include notions of interiority, but in very different ways. For Yang Zhu, the interiority of the body is individual. It's something that an individual can and should protect and cultivate. Whereas the Hippocratic authors describe the interior of the body as hidden and mysterious. Now, as De Scola has shown, the details of distinctions based on interiority and physicality are culturally specific. And these examples, I think, provide further evidence to that point, that we can see that the Chinese and Greek accounts of the relations of body and soul, although both are significantly embodied, they do so in very different ways and for very different reasons. Whether or not we disagree with the anthropologist De Scola's account, it problematizes these relations between inner and outer, and the ways in which we define our physical body. Now, as I think you can see, all of this is work in progress and has provided more questions than answers. But I hope it does suggest some new ways of thinking about the body. And thank you very much for your time and attention.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Raphaels, for the fascinating talk. So we had an overview of actually it's not just only the one view within among the Greeks and even among the Chinese. There's a spectrum of views, but that provides some fascinating comparison. So maybe we can take some questions from the audience. Do we have any question? Yes, please.
I don't know if I have this all correct, but with regard to your closing comments about the medicine and the differences between the Greek view of the internal, external, the soul, the spirit, and the body, and then the view of China where they are more disconnected, is there a parallel allegory or a corollary relationship to the dualistic view of the mind, body, soul, and what would be popular or common in the Chinese view?
Well, that would take a very, very long time to try to answer, but I think it doesn't so much involve the question of the relations of philosophy and medicine. That is, that's a question of two very different social contexts that for whatever reasons, and I don't know what they are, Greek philosophers seem to be very much aware of medical thinking, whereas Chinese philosophers, although in many ways the practices they talk about, there are similar practices described in medical texts, such as the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, and yet they never refer to each other. And I don't know why that is, and it's a really interesting question. But the question that you raise about mind-body dualism, I think, excuse me, the issue there is that in each context there are, if you like, relatively holist and relatively dualist positions and debates between them. For example, Plato is rather famous as a dualist, but if you read Aristotle, he's not, I mean, Aristotle is very complicated, but much in Aristotle rejects the dualism of literally his own teacher. Similarly, in a Chinese context, there are relatively holist and relatively dualist examples. So the stereotype of a holist East and a dualist West is, if anything, it's more of a rhetorical position than anything else. But the problem is it obscures these very important and interesting debates within each culture. So it seems to me would want to compare the debates rather than somehow comparing, you know, Chinese holism versus Western dualism.
There's sort of a spectrum on
yes,
both ends.
But also within each context.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think it's a very big problem. Will that do for now?
That's great.
Do we have another question from the audience? Okay, maybe in the middle.
Thank you. You said that Zhuangzi wished for the spirit to guard the soul so that people would live long. Is there any parallel for that in the Western world to make sure that reason would control spirit? Reason would control both spirit and appetites?
Well, I mean, Zhuangzi literally recommended. Zhuangzi on several places literally recommends Xinzhuai, literally fasting, starving the mind, so that the spirit worked with the body and sort of pushing the mind to the side to live long. That is, that spirit is working with the body, not with the mind. So no, there is actually there is a slight parallel to the chariot, which in you know, there's been a number of very important excavations in China of various important texts that have come out of tombs. And there's a series of texts from a site called Guodian, which was dated to about 300 BC. And there's a number of texts there. And there is one, I think it's entitled Black Robes. And it describes the body and senses as the slaves of the Xin. So it's not animals, but it's slaves. Now, interestingly, in another text from Guodian, there's another passage which says that that the mind rules the body, but it says the mind ruling the body is like the emperor ruling his people, and that they respect and work with each other. So interestingly, in the same tomb, we find two very different accounts of the mind ruling the body, but neither is it in both cases the mind is ruling people. In some cases harmoniously, in one more despotically. Whereas it's in the Greek text that we literally find the body like an animal, not like a hierarchically subordinate person. So, I mean, I think it's a very good question, but no, I don't think there is.
I want to raise a very quick question, because we're looking at very early period material like the Xianqin. And so by the time of the first millennium, Buddhism played a very important role. And of course, it has a different conception of the relationship between body and mind. And I'm thinking of Dhammapada, talking about the mind controlling the behavior. There's an ethical concern. What's your take of this trend in terms of body and mind?
Well, you know, you're the expert on Buddhism here.
In the Chinese context.
So no, really, I mean, my take is one of relative ignorance, if truth be told. But if I can be very speculative, I think there's another question that may be relevant, which is that the idea in Chinese Buddhism of dukkha, of experience being illusion.
Cool, yes.
That enlightenment occurs essentially when you have, I'm resisting the word transcended, but when you have managed to get free of illusion. So that ontology would somehow require the mind to be in charge, wouldn't it? Whereas in a Chinese context, the self-cultivation literature, there's some debate about this, so I'm taking a position here, does not tend to be transcendentalist. That when you live long, you do it by literally strengthening your body in some of these texts. So in that sense, I would say that the ontologies are so different that it's not surprising that the articulation should be different. And to be honest, that's why I stop and don't consider Buddhist texts in this work, because it's a completely different universe.
Right, yes, absolutely. I think that's the denial of the body and being illusionary is this concept is absent in the Chinese context.
And so, you know, they're just completely different universes, I mean, ontologically speaking. And so that's why that's another huge comparison in and of itself, even if it's occurring within a Chinese context.
Maybe we can take the last question from the audience, I believe.
I have a question about this. You know, now when you hear about the spirituality from the Western world, they're talking about the source. And then they say you can name it in whatever names, God, Taoist, or universal energy, whatever you mean it. Is that the same thing as what Zhuangzi is talking about as Shen? Or is it similar stuff or different stuff? Or is there any similarity there?
Well, this may not be a good answer, but let me try. I think part of the confusion is that in a Chinese context, the term Shen refers to two historically different things. That if we look at the Jiaguan, say at the oracle bone inscriptions, or at ritual texts, there's all Shen are outside. They're even in the Lunyu, where Confucius recommends keeping a respectful distance from gods and spirits, right? These, if one thinks of them as powers, they're outside the human being. They're in some sense associated with divinity, but there's a lot of complexity there, right? So that they don't exactly correspond either to God or to what we might call spiritual. But in a Chinese context, this earlier notion, starting, I'd say, in the 4th century BCE, there's this notion, and it's a very powerful one, that humans can get these powers and can control things, literally, to do the things that gods can do. You know, that control the power, and that all these self-cultivation texts are practical, that you want to get these powers. And so it's a very different world than the Western one. Whereas in the
going to death soon, but somehow with those sort of like work, they let the tumor go. I don't know.
I mean, you know, I don't know either.
Things like that happen, so I don't know if it's,
I mean, you know, the whole question in this long tradition, often associated with Taoism, all sorts of claims are made, right? Including attaining literal physical material immortality, right? It's hard to assess these things. But these texts are not going to those extremes. They're not promising eternal life. They're not promising cure of disease. They're more, if you like, promising survival in difficult times. In a sense, they're more modest. I'm afraid this is not a very good answer to your question, but I think they're quite different discourses.
Well, also I have to bear in mind there's a spectrum of different beliefs even within the West and among Chinese. But I'm thinking the sense of agency. I think this tradition from Zhuangzi, when you think about how Chinese think about what we should take and all these medicines and exercise, the sense of we can do something to our body. I think this idea is quite strong among the Chinese. But with that, we wish to thank Professor Raffles once again for the fascinating talk and make us think about the body and our relationship with it.
Thank you so much for your very interesting questions. So I take it there's no external questions?
Yes,
Or there wasn't time.
we will have to.